All right, I'm just going to talk a little bit about what's been going on in terms of events before I get into the meat of the chit chat today. So, had this really epic conversation with Bree Greenberg that'll be released probably next week. It's a 2-hour podcast. It's really I just really enjoy the kinds of high-level conversations I'm able to have now with certain practitioners. So that's gonna piss off a lot of people, but maybe also help some people out. So that'll be out next week. Larissa is doing a bunch of stuff for the patrons this month over at the Patreon. So if you're not a patron subscriber, you can go check that out over at animistarts.art. Lots of classes and different things. There's a tier that has a lot more classes and an archive too, so you can check that out. It's called The Playground. What else is going on? Winter's going on. And I was meaning to do this live dream last week, but it didn't work out because timing is very slow now that winter has truly arrived, regardless of what Western narrative has to say about that. But we are in the first part of actual winter, so my connection's kind of off, so I switched to mobile. So Death Practice Group number 6 of the Plan 13 starting tomorrow, which is about the halfway point. And I've been waiting to get here for a long time. Although I love the first part of how we got here. And it's going to be really interesting because I have a sneaky suspicion that there probably will be almost less than half of the sign-ups than last month, because last month was the ancestor talk and everyone's got a goddamn hard-on for the fucking ancestors. I have a sneaking suspicion I won't see or hear from a lot of those people that signed up for that class. They signed up for it as a kind of desperation grab maybe, or they just wanted to check out what I was saying, or I don't know if they really are going to use what I said or the techniques, but it's really a different paradigm than what is mostly being peddled around. And you can hear about that if you listen to the Laugh Talk. That's on, and I put it up on YouTube, and you can order the recording on the website. So all of it's in perpetuity, right? So I'm not trying to need to repeat myself too often. But basically, I did all that alchemy and concept introduction for 5 months so that we could get here to a place that I think is where sort of maybe like the real practice begins, where we learn the sort of other half or the other side of the coin, the other side of the mirror, which is non-conceptual sleep and dream practice. And I'm going to do the introduction tomorrow for about 4 hours, and then we're just going to continue month after month deepening into this. Now, some people are going to think, Dare, but I'm not done with the conceptual part. I still want to tell stories, and I need to deal with ancestors and journeys and vision quests and shamanic blah, 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 blah. And I go, that's fine. You're still going to do that. But I'm not going to be dishonest and tell you that that's the whole game. Actually, I want to introduce the whole game as soon as possible, which is why I went to 5 months and introduced the whole game. And now we can play the whole game, and no one can pretend that the half the game is the whole game. Because the conceptual part, the journeying part, the making up stories, the re-narrative part, the identification part, all that stuff, that's only like a real small. That's like what you do at the beginning. That's what you do sometimes when you need it. And for a lot of people, when they're starting to try to break through to non-dual awareness, they got to do it a lot. But there's this other half that Westerners really have to deal with, which is what they teach a lot in certain traditions. So like Zen, so Dogen, Soto Zen tradition teaches this. In Tibetan Dzogchen, this would be like not Dzogchen, but in like Vajrayana, this would be like shamatha meditation, not Vipassana. This would be like shamatha meditation. In Taoist meditation, this would be Zhuang. In Sufi meditation, this would be like what happens when you whirl for a very, very, very long time. In Greek traditions, old school Greek, animist Greek stuff, like Peter Kingsley talks about, this would be dream incubation, but also other things like dark retreats, which also happens in Taoism. And in Dzogchen and Hatha Yoga, this is sort of like clear light Rigpa kind of training to get to the point where you don't need to imagine things anymore. You can just perceive clearly, and there's no more hallucinations at all, but things appear as they appear. But you're not needing to imagine things happening to get them to happen anymore. And also when things don't happen, you're not upset. So this is the non-conceptual part, and it's actually the best part, I think. It's the part that has the most peace in it, which is, I think, what most people need and want, is this abiding peacefulness, regardless of what happens. And this is why it is the core of death practice, because most people's problems with death are the story they're telling themselves and the culture is telling them about dying. That's part of the big problem, is the stories we tell about death, the fears that we're not willing to deal with because we think the fears are true. And in some way they might be a little true. You might have a personal truth in there, but we think they're absolute truth, and that's not true. But we got to get to the point where we can dream beyond our fictions of death, right? And we can be and exist beyond our fictions of dying. And part of that is telling better fictions first. Maybe that's writing poetry or doing speculative fiction writing or whatever, but part of it is first telling better fictions. But where do those better fictions come from? That's what non-conceptual practices in non-dual animist traditions are trying to get us to recognize or realize, is that there is a place, a preeminent place, a pre-differentiated place, a pre-ethical space from which all these post-ethical doctrines and storylines and narratives emerge from, and then go back to, so they die back into this kind of potentiality field, which is pre-conceptual or non-conceptual. And so all of the better fictions that we want to tell the world, and we want better fictions in our politics, and we want better fictions in our marriages, and we want better fictions in our society, in our cultures, right? We want better fictions. That's culture, is a better, like fictional things that we believe in together. We want better fictions. Then we have to understand where and how those better fictions arise, and that's non-conceptual practice. Most people will still want the sort of so-called normal way of receiving inspiration, which is somebody gave it to me, or somebody did this to me, some kind of angel or muse gave me the download. So that's still the dualistic version of what we're talking about. It's very downstream. It's like, oh, there's an appearance of a being, and I'm going to say that that being is absolutely real. And they gave it to me, and I received it, and I'm a happy little, soldier of God now. But the reality is if you track that back upstream, what's happening? Where did that being arise from? Where did that wisdom arise from? Oh, back and back and back. And back doesn't really mean back, but we can think of it like that, just as a kind of introduction. to the process. We can kind of imagine that there is a back home to go to. But really, that's not true. And what non-conceptual practice is, it proves itself via intimate contact. And that intimate contact is like peeling away band-aids that we don't know we have over our eyes and ears and mouth and nose and our skin. And we're peeling off all of these band-aids. We're peeling off band-aids we didn't know were there. Until we get to something that is, you could say, is more raw and more naked and more honest and more pure, which means it's less distinct and less categorizable and less able to, it's like a Teflon. Nothing sticks to it. If you try to put a name on it, it just disappears. It's a complete solute, so it's like water in the sense that it will dissolve everything into itself. It's like space in the sense that it can hold everything and not be perturbed, right? So you put 10,000 elephants in there and the space is undisturbed. The elephants are disturbed because you have put 10,000 elephants in there, but the actual space that the elephants exist inside of and actually are made of is not disturbed in any way. Just like water dissolves everything eventually. It just happens. So non-conceptual practice is the practice of both celebrating and expressing this basic nature, and taking off these third eye band-aids so that we can feel the peacefulness of what we actually are, what we are made out of, where we come from and where we go back to, regardless of the appearances, permutations, and events that appear during all of that experience. So we're born and we die, right? So we're born, we live some amount of time, and we die. We think that life is in between the being born and the dying. But what I'm saying is that life and death are the same thing, and they're existing beyond merely the arc of birth-death. But because we have a body, we are able to experience a kind of dualistic shadow play, light and shadow, which is I'm born and there's a lifetime where I'm born, and then I die and there's a something when I die. There's like a death time, lifetime and death time. But it's not only that simple. We're also having this lifetime, death time in wake time, sleep time. And we think that dreams happen only at night when we're sleeping. But what we start to realize with non-conceptual sleep and dream practice is that dreaming is happening all the time. We just label it different things because we want to feel like the truth is controllable by our mind. So the intellect wants to predict so it can keep us safe. And to do that, it starts to categorize everything into things that are distinct from other things. This is daytime, this is nighttime. This is sleep time, this is wake time, this is this, and this is that. That is useful to a point, and that's the conceptual part. That's the intellect kind of ego development part, where you have to develop differentiation. But once you've developed enough differentiation, because you can develop differentiation forever, it never stops. That's reductionist science. There's constant differentiation. Oh, we found molecules and atoms, and now there's more stuff, and now it's quarks and quantums and stuff. And it's like, yeah, you'll always be able to see and find more differentiation because perception learns how to perceive more of what you perceive. It's a practice. So if you start to perceive more and more differentiation, you will see or perceive more differentiation. And this is useful to a degree, like I said, to be able to have distinction between this and that. I want to walk through the door, not the wall, right? Because the wall has no opening. And if I couldn't differentiate, I would be angry and try to be like, why can't I move through this wall? It's because the door's not there. But, like I said, that's half the equation. Conceptuality, differentiation, dualistic reality. Not the whole part. So now we go to the second part, which is the most fun part, which is now you start to unidentify. You start to de-differentiate, undifferentiate. You start to unlearn the constant habitual addiction to dualistic perception. You start to be able to see commonalities, similarities. You start to be able to feel peacefulness, regardless of pain, fear, and hunger. You start to go beyond pain, fear, and hunger into what those energies actually mean or are, without needing to label them constantly. And that means you can dream beyond your fictions of death. This doesn't mean you are superpower immortal. It just means the basic nature of reality is immortality itself. On some level. But that doesn't mean we're all superhero Buddhists or Buddhas, divas, and that's still part of dualistic reality. Angels and devils. Avatars and fuck-ups who don't know what they're doing. Right? Like there's this whole hierarchy of like better and worse. That's still the dualistic reality. I'm talking about getting to a place where you can let that go, stop it for brief moments, and then abide inside of it for longer and longer. The ego is very afraid of this because our decision-making process has been trained to make decisions based on dualistic perception only. We don't yet know in the West how to make decisions, shared, both personal and collective decisions, in a non-dual frame. The closest we're getting there is with people, and I know a lot of these people, but the closest we're getting is this edge of complexity science. Nora Bateson, my friend Carrie Munn, they're teaching organizations to listen to the field, to think collectively, to intuit collectively, to have group field dynamics, listening dynamics that are field dynamic based. This is not the edge I'm talking about, but I'm just trying to locate you in the cultural soup, which is really, part of the job that I'm trying to do is educate and bring these maps to the forefront and say there are maps within maps within maps, and you need to know where you're at. You need to know where you're at. You need to know where your organization is at. You need to know where your family's at. You need to know where your lover is at. Because if you don't know where people are at, and you don't know where you're at, it's going to be really hard to try to come to some kind of coherence. You want to have some kind of coherency, right? Because we're still making decisions even if we don't make decisions. Not making a decision is a decision, right, on some level. Choosing to do non-conceptual practice, which is a non-doing, is still, on some level, a kind of doing because you're deciding to do it. But when you start to live inside this world as a priority, as in you've decided to prioritize being in the world as it really is, which is a non-dual existence with a dualistic coding, I suppose you could say, then you start to understand that a lot of these narratives around trauma and history and race and gender are fucking illusory dreams. They're dreams that people decide are true. They're fictions. But some fictions fuck you up. And you, as the practitioner, have to learn which of the fictions that you're currently coveting are fucking you up. And what you're going to do about that. So, April Dawn Harder is a wonderful therapist and thought leader, talks about the root of addiction being a kind of narcissism. this is kind of true. The Buddha said that the root of all suffering is craving or attachment, right? Attachment/craving. They're really talking about kind of the same things, but I want to clear it up a little bit and go further, which is there is this thing that happens, which is to survive, we need to make distinctions on some level as a species. And some of those distinctions give us massive dopamine hits. And that was a neurological evolutionary process. Just because we got a massive dopamine hit doesn't mean it's good for us. And we know that because if you just snort a bunch of cocaine, you'll feel really great and then you'll get fucked up. But if you just went off of the sensation, you might say, this is a good option. This is a good option. I should get more of this dopamine hit. But that's the conceptual world. The conceptual world is appearances, strange things happen, things bounce off each other, we don't know what's going on. The non-conceptual world is more of this long-term thinking, this longer-term existence, which is we don't really know what's good for us. We actually can't trust, as in this kind of 100% authoritarian trust. We can't really trust our sensations at a certain level, because our sensations are trying to predict things for us. But life is not predictable. Reality is not predictable. So if our sensations, including our perceptions or perceptual sensations, are trying to predict things, then we have to look at the cutting-edge pain science that's coming out of New Zealand, and they're saying the same thing, that pain, the process of pain, the experience of pain, is largely a predictive process. Chronic pain is a broken predictive process in the neural system. This gets really creepy, right? Because you're starting to go, well, so I'm not really feeling pain? No, you are feeling pain, but you have to understand it's a prediction. It's a kind of hallucination. It's a kind of expectation. So if we're expecting things and they start to happen more, we start to get in a real weird place. Because now we start to get to explain why people have bad trips, why people maybe get possessed by certain ghosts, is because there's a kind of priming in the system for a bad thing to happen. There's kind of an expectation that bad shit's going to happen to you. And that if bad shit happens to you, then there's another prediction that says you're going to be fucked up forever, or you're going to go to hell, or, like there's a constant predictive model happening, and that's really terrifying. Non-conceptual practice teaches us that we can just let that happen and not fixate on it and actually attune to some larger field of reality that is not merely about dopamine hits, and it also isn't about this ping-ponging between ups and downs. Oh, I'm happy, now I'm angry. I'm happy, now I'm angry. Now I'm sad, now I'm happy, and whatever. You get what I'm saying? You get what I'm saying? There's a dark side of the moon here. There's a dark side of the moon. So the moon is a mirror. Right? You know that, right? The moon is a mirror. It reflects light from the sun. We only see the part of the moon that is reflecting light. Just like we only see the front of a mirror and the reflection that it reflects back to us. And it reflects back without any damage to the mirror. The mirror is just reflecting whatever comes in front of it. It doesn't care. It doesn't have any opinions about it. It doesn't have any preferences. This is very key. So the mirror is fully at peace. You break the mirror and it just starts to reflect more. It's like, oh yeah, there's just more mirror. It's like a hologram. You cut it up and it's just more of itself. So we are at first going to the mirror and seeing reflections, and we like them and we don't like them. I don't like how I look. I don't like the way that looks. I don't like the reflection. I like that reflection. I don't like this reflection. Right? But what I'm talking about in non-conceptual practice, and I'm using a conceptuality to tell a story about it. I'm using a fiction to tell a better fiction that will eat itself. Which is to say, we walk up to the mirror, we get real comfortable with it, and then we begin to become like a mirror, And not only that, we want to go to the dark side of the mirror, which is the mirror that is holding up the reflection. Behind the mirror, it's still the mirror, but there's a dark side of the moon that exists in order for the light side to exist, the side that reflects the light. So non-conceptual practice is about getting closer and closer, more intimate, more contact, more relational play with this dark side of the moon, or the dark side of the mirror. And that requires us to have enough skill in dealing with our pain, fear, and hunger that when we start to see reflections that we don't like, and when we start to become reflections that we have preferences about, we can deal with it. And we can go further and further into non-dual awareness instead of constantly jumping back out of the water because we hate the water. Like, we go in the water, it's nice, and then we get afraid, and then we jump out. And we go back in the water, and it's nice, and then something happens, and we freak out, and we jump out. And it's okay for a while if we acclimate to the process. At a certain point, we have to really understand, why are we jumping out of the water? Why are we freaking out? Why are we constantly going back to conceptual, dualistic perception in order to make sense? Why are we having this bullshit white person idea of meaning-making crisis, sense-making crisis? Why are all these white people, not just white people, why are all these Westerners flocking to ayahuasca and coming back with the most heinous delusions about what happened? Because I've done Mother Vine. I don't need to do it again. I did it 10 times. I listened the whole time. I listened to the mother. I dealt with what she was telling me to deal with. I went through it. Now it's no more. I don't need to go back and do it again. Why are people doing this thousands of times, hundreds of times? This doesn't make any sense. You don't need to do it unless you're going to hold the medicine for other people, and I don't think most people need to be doing that job. So why are people just doing a bunch of entheogens and getting more stories? And why do these stories never quite satisfy anybody? Why are they not fulfilling? Why do they just lead to more quests and more stories? It's like a never-ending video game. Well, I beat this video game, and now I need to go beat another video game, and another video game, and another video game. Hey, I get it. It's addicting to feel accomplishment, and you just play video game after video game. I like video games. It's great. I like stories, too. I read a lot of stories. But the piece I was looking for, I couldn't find in those stories. And I couldn't find in those video games. Because if you're not being told a story by someone who's gone beyond stories, and I'm talking about mythology too, beyond mythologies, and I'm not talking about atheism, because atheism is also a mythology. I'm talking about going beyond the constant generation of stories, thoughts, ideas, and concepts in order to feel safe and control reality. Controlling your perception of reality constantly in order to try to get the thing that you can't get that way. And in fact, the idea of getting and the idea of owning and the idea of having is part of the very same problem. Because we all know we get something that we've wanted for 10 years, and we feel really good for a little bit. And then we want something new. So what am I talking about here? We all do it. It's totally fine to do it, but we have to understand it's only half the game. It's only half the game to keep getting things, to keep telling stories, to keep having hallucinatory, visionary experiences, to keep believing them, and then going, oh, well, then I grew out of that. Now I believe this new fucking mythology. well, you're going to grow out of that too. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, if you keep growing, you're going to just have a parade of memories about all the times that you believed something and it helped you or it gave you some effect for a little bit of time, and then you grew out of it, or it didn't work anymore. Like, we've all had that experience. I'm not talking about anything mystical. And that's the other thing about this non-dual practice. It's not about attaining more mystical powers. In fact, some of those mystical powers are the band-aids that I'm talking about pulling off. It's like you don't actually need them. They just kind of do a thing. It's like an app on your phone. You can download a billion apps, but do you ever use them? Well, it's nice to have them, but do you ever fucking use them? I don't. I just download them and go, oh, that's interesting. So, I'm not saying you're going to stop doing conceptual addiction, craving, attachment stuff. You're not. I think as long as we're alive, living in the Western world, where everyone is clawing at each other for some idea of gaining progress, I don't think it's going to stop. But what I think we can do as people living in the West is engage in the Western world, our neighbors, our friends, our family, engage. Like, don't run away to a fucking mountain like you're some special person that gets to do that. Don't fucking do that shit. But if you start to practice non-conceptual practices, sleeping and dreaming practices, you're going to have a completely changed experience of your waking, dualistic reality. You're going to have a completely different experience, but it takes time and it takes effort because you have to retrain your neural network to perceive differently and make decisions based on the different perceptions. And that's why I went through 5 months of the basics, learning how to use the 5 eyes, so you can already switch between 5 different kinds of meaning making already. If you can already switch between 5 different kinds of meaning making, you're not going to be so weirded out when meaning disappears. Because you know, oh, I can just make 5 different kinds of meaning anytime I want. Let's try this other secret third thing, like the meme says. Right? And what's the secret third thing? It's the non-absence absence. It's the loss of loss. It's the not doing, it's the wu wei, it's all the things that people mystically talk about, but it starts to become really ordinary, and we have to practice at it. Because I don't know why. I don't know why we have to practice at it. To be completely honest, I wish it could just be like, oh, we just do it like cats and dogs do it. But something about humans, we hyperfixate on the narrative process. We're constantly making myths and fictions up all the time. We're secreting them as if they're just coming out of us, they're just blah forever, And some people, they latch onto that, they ride it like a horse, and they become very successful. And they just write a lot of books, and they get paid a lot of money because they're really good at telling people the next story they really want to hear. But that's not the peace and liberation that I'm wanting for myself or for all of my kinfolk, all of my brothers and sisters and non-binary everybody's. The kind of liberation I'm talking about is where we can stop telling stories together. We can be together and not have to tell all these stories all the time. It's really possible to do. It's really possible to just be together and experience that being without constantly having to narrate or make meanings or think about safety or deal with trauma triggers and all this other bullshit that everyone's constantly ping-ponging. That's the internal game. The internal game is we begin through these practices to harness our agency in stopping the perceptive reactions, meaning making. And we all have to go through this on our own, because nobody can do it for us. But other people can model it because they're willing to play the inner game. You may not be able to be willing to play the inner game. You might not even think it's possible. There are plenty of people out there that believe it's impossible to play this game because their neurology has been so damaged that they're expecting trauma all the time. All I'm saying is that I've been there and I got out of it. And you can too. And it's not magical, but oh boy, it feels magical once you make the shift. But at a certain point, you have to become ordinary about it. You have to make it so that it's not so crazy, like hiking a mountain. It doesn't need to be like that. It doesn't need to be like, oh, I need 15 certifications, and I need a guru transmission, and I need this, and I need an angel to love me, and I need Kali to give me a blessing. No, you don't need any of that. If it happens during the course of non-conceptual sleep and dream practice, take it. I mean, like if you're having the practice and it's happening, I mean, it would be disrespectful to be an asshole and say, oh no. But if you're trying to generate it because you think until you have it, you can't be happy, that's the problem I'm talking about. We don't need to constantly be imagining things happening to us in order to be okay. We don't constantly need to be imagining things happening in order to protect ourselves. There's a different way of sensing, perceiving, and making decisions. And it requires an introduction to these concepts and practices because it's not being modeled for us and nobody's talking about it. Most trauma therapy schools are not talking about this. So how would you know? You might have the experience because it happens naturally. See, that's the other thing too. This isn't owned by any religion. There are just certain religions and philosophies that figured out that this was the fucking best thing, and they made a whole process around it. But most people are able to experience this just naturally, but they might not have a name for it, and they might not have any social support to discuss it, so it doesn't get stronger. Or they might be actively repressed, which is to say they might have this non-dual, non-conceptual experience, and then the people around them start treating them terribly, and so they learn to not do it. And because they don't want to be treated terribly, so they just go, I'll stop doing this. This has been the issue with humans for, hundreds of thousands of years, is that we don't have a very good way of discerning how to deal with complex things that confuse us and don't sort of like fit into our narrow categories and boxes. So, obviously I'm talking around and all through this dark side of the mirror thing, just to give people an opportunity to feel what it's like to kind of come in and out of this kind of like confusing peacefulness. And it is a confusing peacefulness. And I tell people sometimes a good mantra you can have is that you want to learn to rest inside of peaceful confusion. You want to understand that that's going to be there all the time, so it's immediately available to you. Like, confusion's always available, but most people don't think it's peaceful. And they certainly don't think they can rest inside of it. So at the beginning, we learn to rest inside of peaceful confusion. That's the conceptual way to get to the non-conceptual. And so the introduction that I'm going to do tomorrow for 4 hours, I'm going to outline a lot of the dream and sleep hygiene. I'm going to outline a bunch of the various non-conceptual practices and give like menu options and give more further reading. But basically, mostly what I'm going to try to do is model this idea that we can take what we learned in the first 5 months, which is what we've learned all of our lives, which is this conceptual story making, constantly generating stories all the time. We can actually use that to get into the non-conceptual. Once we get there, though, we have to learn to ease off of the gas pedal of conceptuality because it takes us out of the experience. But what we can do is we can kind of play this kind of this parabolic, this kind of Mobius strip, which is, if we're on this track and half the track is conceptual and half the track is non-conceptual, if I can just keep doing this, then I know when the conceptual starts to take over because it wants control, that eventually it'll just lose control again, and then I'll go back into the non-conceptual. So at the beginning of the practice, and maybe the beginning is 10 years, I don't know, 20 years, who cares? But for a lot of people, you're just going to have to get used to this kind of going into the void and feeling rest and stability and ease and love and all these great things that actually can't be named. And then you'll start to name them and come out of the experience. And then you'll go, well, I want the experience again. And then what I'm going to introduce is the methods by which you could use the very same process that took you out to go back in. That's all I'm really saying. I'm saying we're not trying to say conceptuality is bad. We're just using it not to its fullest capacity. We're not using storytelling to dissolve itself, which is what I think is a really fascinating part of being able to tell stories, is you can get to a place where it's very strange and it doesn't really matter. And then you can rest. You can tell restful stories that don't have things about protecting, don't have things about distinguishing in them, don't have issues about, good or evil, value judgments, right? Because imagine telling a story that didn't have value judgments. And imagine telling stories that didn't have distinctions. I mean, most stories are just distinctions, right? How else would we tell the story? But there are ways to be able to tell stories that eat themselves. They might not be stories the way that we usually consume them on Netflix or in novels or whatever. Because those stories are not necessarily the ones that get the funding. But what I'm saying, as natural human storytellers, each of us can actually learn to harness and generate the stories on purpose. First step, doing it on purpose. Second step, leading it down towards a very strange non-conceptual place where the story eats itself. And as a person who, is pretty good at communication, I wasn't always good at communication. I had to learn, and I used non-dual practice and poetry and surrealistic poetry techniques and writing techniques to understand something about how the language center actually works in the brain. And it's not something I can readily describe because in some level it doesn't stick. But I model it all the time. I model this way of using words to kind of get at underneath them, or the source of the words. So that when we have perceptions arise, stories arise in our experience of the world, like whatever it is, this place is too crowded. That's a story. Maybe it is too crowded, I don't know. But the point is it's a story. And then we can go, okay, how did that get generated in my mind? And now, how can I use that to go into peacefulness now? Because if I couldn't generate a story that says this place is too crowded, I can generate a whole lot of other stories too. And each of those stories is like a little doorway to something else. And we want to be able to find these little doorways, make these little doorways, go through these little doorways until we can get to the dark side of the moon. And then we can feel the peace that is darkness and death, that are beyond our fictions about what darkness and death actually are. Oh, it's boring. Oh, it's terrifying. Oh, I've lost everything. Those are all fictions. We don't fucking know what any of that shit means. But we think we know what it means. And we don't want it. So we're going to resist every attempt to go there. And we're also going to hurt other people who want to go there. And we're going to say we're doing it for their own good. So I just want you to understand, if you're trying to figure out how this fits into social justice, this is social justice. This is social justice. Because all the fictions about race and gender and class and ability, they're all fictions. All you need to do is be with what is right now. And whatever it is, whatever condition, whatever shape, whatever, set of parameters, that's what it is. It's not good or bad or worse or better. It just is. But we've developed a world in which we've barred access to certain kinds of beings. And we kill certain kinds of beings because we make a story up. What's happening in Iran right now is based on fictions that people believe to be true. And so they're going to kill a bunch of people because they want those fictions to be enforced. So, what I'm saying is we need more people who are not just telling better stories, which is kind of like harm reduction. Well, it'd be a better story if you just had a law. If we passed a law that said you couldn't do this, that's a better story for now. It's like a stopgap measure. But to get to the place that we're all going, which is death, we need to go beyond just telling a better story. Right? And, we're not going to save the world tomorrow. We're not going to save our species tomorrow. Our species might be wanting to explode. Our species might want to go extinct, to find the rest that it won't give itself. And what I'm saying is, for all of us listening, we have the potential, the capacity, and the opportunity, the privilege to go there before we go extinct. Before we actually die, we can get comfortable with the process so that when we do die, no matter how we die, if we get murdered, if it nuclear war, if we just run out of water, you can't drink anymore, however we die, we will know how to do it. And we will be okay. We will still have pain, and we will still have fear, and we will still have hunger, but we will know how to go past and beyond and through those experiences into the non-dual world, into the dark side of the mirror, into space itself. No problem. So that's been my little talk for today. I hope that you got something out of it. Even if you don't believe me, that's fine. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm just saying, entertain it. Tell the story to yourself. See what happens. See what happens if you begin to believe that there is a different story that you can tell in which everybody gets to be okay sooner or later. And we still have to deal with what we have to deal with. We're not going to escape. There is no escape. And we are going to die. So, that's the way it is. So, tomorrow, 4 p.m. Pacific time. Going to do this for about 4 hours. You can buy a ticket on Ticket Tailor. All the links should be in the bio, linky, or go to animistarts.art and find the Death Practice group page, and then you can find a way to buy tickets. Otherwise, you can buy the recording later when it is available, probably in like a week or so, and listen at your own leisure. You can also buy the old recordings and see the whole progression, because it really is a progression. I'm really I'm really doing the thing that I want to do, which is give an entire cycle of teaching and see what happens. No holds barred. And there will be an interview with Bree Greenberg that's really illuminating that will be released next week. And most of my podcasts, you can get free information. And I have a Substack that I post a lot of free writing on. If anyone would like to donate, the donation links are always available, paypal.me/daresohei. Or you can join the Patreon. You can come to a paid class. We're going to do new classes in 2023 that are going to be much more sort of full out kind of both in person and online. Because both of us are non-dual theater arts people, and that's what we want to get to. We want to get to the place where we can really play together and not just explain things. So all of the explanation that I'm doing is a way to prime the system, prime the community to get to the point where we can just practice and play together using all of these words, concepts, ideas, etc. What else? This will probably be recorded and I'll put it up on YouTube and on Instagram so you can just like listen to it again. I think that's it for now. Thanks so much. It's not scarce. I'm trying to make this stuff not scarce because that's part of the issue with all of this teaching is that it's behind paywalls and everyone says you have to like have guru transmissions to understand it and all of this attainment and like Jesus fucking Christ, it's so complicated. It is complex, but it doesn't have to be so complicated. The basics are the basics, and once we understand the basics, we can decide what we want to do from there. But most people don't even understand the basics, so let's just get everyone understanding the basics first. Thank you all so much. I hope this was a benefit for you, all of your people, ancestors and the descendants, and all beings. It was good for me, I enjoy just letting the energy, teaching, whatever, come through, and it's a gorgeous day. And I hope that I hope that wherever you are, you can enjoy wherever you're at. Whatever's going on. Okay? So thank you so much. Peace. Talk to you whenever I talk to you in the future. Bye.